Good morning. It's nice to be with you today. Kathy Ketchum, our wonderful minister, is still recovering from her ankle surgery. So I'll do my best to offer us some thoughts for reflection this morning. We do continue to ask you to keep Kathy and Jim in your prayers as she continues her recovery. We are in the church season of Lent. It can be a time of meditation and reflection on our lives and drawing closer in faith to God and Jesus. It can also be a time of confession. So I'll start this morning with a confession that in the last 11 months, it feels like that is all I've done. Reflect and meditate. And to be honest, I'm getting really tired of it. Go away, COVID. But alas, it is Lent. When I was in the active ministry, I often did series of sermons during Lent, sometimes on biblical folk. Since my retirement 5 years ago, I find myself each Lent now drawn again and again to Moses and how the conclusion of his life helps me to understand the meaning of my life a little better. We hear that conclusion of his life in chapter 34 of Deuteronomy. You may remember Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him the whole land, Gilead as far as Dan, all Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah as far as the western sea, the Negeb and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. And God said to Moses, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. And I've let you see it, Moses, with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." Then Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the Lord's command. Say, what? The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. Then the period of mourning for Moses was ended. The end? Throughout our lives, I think we have all known some disappointment or frustration, or at times an unhappy ending. I figured by this time that my wife and I would probably have made at least one, if not two, trips to New Hampshire to see that wonderful 4-year-old granddaughter of ours. Instead, we do FaceTime twice a week. It hasn't turned out quite the way I thought it would. It reminds me of the story of the little boy, about 3 or 4 years old, who kept standing up in the church pew. His daddy would say, "Sit down," and the little boy would stand up again. This went on until finally the father grabbed him by the shoulders and sort of pushed him down in the pew and demanded, "I said, sit down." The little boy looked up at his dad and said, "I may be sitting down outside, but inside I'm still standing up." An unhappy ending perhaps, but still a dream. Today is the second Sunday in the season of Lent. We will have Easter at the end of these 40 days, hopefully with some of the celebration it brings. But today we ponder one of the more moving stories in the history of the human family, the biblical story of Moses. 40 years he struggled with a stubbornly defiant people. 40 years he dwelt in tents and lived off the land. 40 years he was a pilgrim and sojourner, and all to one end, that he might reach the promised land. At last that fateful day arrived. He stood on Mount Nebo across from Jericho and gazed longingly into the promised land. But then we're told God said, "I've let you see the promised land, Moses, but you shall not yourself cross over into it." And there, a stone's throw short of his life's goal, he died. Of all the dreadful ways for something to work out for a great and good person like Moses, this is about the worst. There is another memorable incident I read of once from a shipload of Jews who were fleeing Nazi Germany during World War II and were not permitted to enter as immigrants into America. They were turned back at our shoreline. And one disheartened soul said, 6 months we have been wandering. Now this? But an old rabbi said, my child, Moses wandered for 40 years and was turned back. You must be more patient. More patient? But how? There's some disappointments too great for so shallow a word. There's some frustrations, some dashed hopes, some shattered dreams that seem to call for impatience more than anything else, and a little or maybe a lot of hurt and anger thrown in. If we listened carefully to the Old Testament story this morning, we may have wondered at the accuracy of it. For we are told that Moses went up on Mount Nebo and from there was able to see all the promised land. But the experts tell us this is not physically possible. The story has been embellished. And yet this curious description of Moses may be nearer the truth than any other. For Moses, in his mind's eye, had been looking at the promised land for 40 years. It had been a dream, a vision, something no one else had seen, but he had seen it. And that is the first great truth we should learn from all this. The promised land is always something inward, a matter of heart and mind, something of the spirit. A bit like that little boy who could still see himself standing, even though he was sitting in the pew. One legend that has gathered around this curious biblical incident has God saying to a protesting Moses, "Why must you go over into the promised land, Moses? You've always had it in your heart. Your people never have. Let them enter. You've been there long enough. Now it's time for you to come home and be with me." Most of us prefer the happy ending rather than the joy of the journey. Many of us look for some promised land somewhere far distant rather than being conscious of what we already have. Many of us are easily tempted to define failure as not arriving where we intended to arrive, not achieving our goals, not meeting our objectives. Well, it's good to set goals and objectives and work toward them. But if they don't turn out the way we expect, it does not necessarily mean it was a failure. Moses did not reach his goal. He meant to enter the promised land and didn't. But what about all those 40 years before? What about the people he had created out of a mob? What about the loyalty and devotion and character he'd built? What about the 10 commandments he had brought down from Mount Sinai? The truth for us all is that the journey is what most counts. We human beings are always on the go. We're not planted and lifeless. We're pilgrims, sojourners, and only so do we stay alive. And that being so, it is the journey we should enjoy. It is the journey that should give deepest meaning to our lives. Relationships, friendships, do not always achieve every expectation, but if we are honest and reflective, we can find something good in them. There are always some things that happen that are meaningful, and in any relationship we grow in character and grace. Children and grandchildren never turn out quite the way we expected, but it may be their dreams are not our dreams. They're not something we possess to be a fulfillment of our desires and expectations. Instead, we give our children away to themselves, to the world, to God, and we journey with them. And we treasure those moments that are tender and funny and playful and wonderful. Or perhaps our vocation or work has not given us what we had hoped for. No promotion that would have brought us to our promised land, to greater financial success that we dreamed of. But something has been there. Moments of joy with people and friends, moments when we have sensed the Spirit of God touching our lives. Moses did not enter the promised land, but he marched toward it for 40 years. But what about our 40 years? What about my 40 years? That really is the bigger part of the story, the traveling, not arriving. It may be Moses did not cross over into the promised land, but for 40 long years he had lived with the dream in his heart. And how about us? How about me? It was the journey that mattered most. And how about us? How about me? I think this leads to one other great truth. Nothing that is really great and important is ever finished in one generation. Each person dies with something undone. We never do all we had intended, nor see everything we had expected to see, nor brought fulfillment even to our own lives. Moses had come out of Egypt. There he had seen the great pyramids. They had been finished in one generation. But Moses was not building pyramids. He was building a people. He was creating a nation. And the task of people building, growing in God's love, is never finished in a single generation, nor in a single lifetime. We must learn, as the rabbi had suggested to the distraught refugees fleeing Nazi Germany, to be patient. We must do what we can and then trust others and God to see that what we have begun will be continued. For the truth of our human life is this: the most important thing of all is the growth of the human spirit, our growth, and that is without ending. We never quite cross over into what we think should be the promised land, but we keep growing and moving toward God's light. We yearn for completeness, for something that can be wrapped up neatly, for a conclusion, for a finish, a kind of promised land. But finished for human beings can also mean dead. And we are not finished. We ought to stay alive all life long and then journey further still into God. Moses never crossed over into the promised land, but for his time, he went as far as it was possible for a person to go. And each of us, in his or her own way, is called to that same sort of dream. We ought to be making everything we can of ourselves, no matter our age, and then, knowing we are still unfinished, and what we have set our heart to is still incomplete, trust another generation, or trust God for the rest. The hymnist understood it this way: O Jesus, I have promised to serve you to the end. Remain forever near me, my Savior and my friend. I shall not fear life's struggles if you are by my side, nor wander from the pathway if you will be my guide. We should not be saddened that Moses never went over into the promised land, for he had to have seen it more clearly than any other person in all history. For the promised land is always inward, a matter of our heart and mind. And for those who believe, a matter of God's Spirit moving through our whole lives. We should not be saddened by the incompleteness of Moses' journey either, for no person's journey is ever quite complete. But something else lives on. Something else lives on. But for that, we must trust God. Amen.